Okay, cool. Helmi, do I start again?
Great. Yep, you can proceed.
All right, cool. So welcome to the grand finals of ABP 2020. On opening government, we have UPD 2. On opening opposition, we have NUS 1. On closing government, we have Taylor's 1. And on closing opposition, we have Ateneo 1. I'm Tiali, and I'm your chair. And on panel with me are Bobby, Connor, Dominic, Enting, Erica, Fardeen, Taha, and Uday. Without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to begin this debate.
Hello, mic test. Is this clear?
Yep.
What are adaptive preferences? We think that simply these are preferences that are inconsistent to one's well-being, made under conditions that are not conducive to their well-being. These are things that can exist in a spectrum. It can look like things like banning whitening products, for example, that entrench individuals to have to follow beauty standards, for example. But it can also be like reforming courts, where the standard is not like beyond reasonable doubt, but rather it is about the balance of probability or whatnot. We think that the problem in status quo is quite simple, that individuals, women, are forced to create decisions and create identities and create professional careers based on choices that are not their own. It is similar, for example, to an individual who says that this is something that I cannot achieve, therefore this is what is acceptable for me, and that is the life I will form my life around. We think that this is something that we have to condemn, and we think is something that the feminist movement should act on. But let's be clear, right? What necessarily does this look like? What are adaptive preferences? It looks like, for example, buying into the idea of beauty standards, saying that you need to straighten your hair, have to utilize whitening products. It means wearing a hijab in an ultra-conservative society because your family and your religion tells you to do so. It looks like cases in India and Pakistan, where even in cases of extreme domestic abuse, it is very, very difficult for the woman to leave the relationship because of the societal expectation that they have to stay within that relationship and have to take the violence, because that is what a marriage looks like for an individual in the society. It looks like people not wanting to have children, women who are decided that they do not want to be mothers, but they are continuously told within their society that motherhood is something that is rewarding, when in fact it is something that is simply not factually true. That is the life that these women are condemned to, and we think that the feminist movement, as the movement who has the responsibility to protect them and provide them with agency that they did not have before, this is something that they ought to do. We think that this is about providing women with agency and choices that they have been deprived of, and simply this is what the feminist movement ought to do. What am I going to be arguing then, coming from Prime Minister? One, I'll be talking about the principle and why exactly this aligns with the goals of the feminist movement. And second, I'll be talking to you about our worst case, right? In the worst case where this is something that is not successful, why is this still something that the feminist movement should be able to employ? So first, on the principle, why does the feminist movement have to do this? The first thing that I want to talk about is simply the idea of autonomy and equality. Notice that in all of these situations, women do not get to decide for themselves what they ought to do in these situations. Rather, it is always the patriarchal society that tells them what to do. Opposition might tell you, well, all choices are coerced anyway, right? The job that you enter is determined by economic situations and all of these things, right? But notice that for a woman, it is always fundamentally different. Aside from economic circumstances that determine what are the careers, for example, that you ought to take, you have your families teaching you since you are a child that this is the job that you have to enter into, that you need to be the child carer, that your husband is the individual who gets to decide in the home what you ought to do, or simply you have to stay within a marriage even if this marriage is detrimental to you as an individual. We think that there is no autonomy for these individuals. And as the feminist movement, the movement that champions wanting to provide women with rights and choices and opportunities that they otherwise did not have before, they need to be able to do this, right? But aside from autonomy and choice, it is the feminist movement who needs to act in this way to ensure that individuals save themselves from themselves, right? That is to say, these individuals, for example, enter into sex work, even if it is something that is harmful for them. You see in third world countries, in red light districts, where individuals are harmed, where their pimps harm them, where their clients harm them, and even the police, for example, harm them, right? But there is no kind of government intervention that exists. We say in a world in which the feminist movement lobbies and successfully lobbies for this means that there are regulations that are in place that better protect these women. Even in the worst case where you criminalize this work and deprive them of this work, we say that it is still a world in which they are able to better get those opportunities that they otherwise would have taken anyway. The problem is in society right now, in third world countries, for example, the reason as to why women enter into sex work is because their alternatives are simply worse, right? A lot of the time it is being domestic helpers or working in the factories or working in construction, which is quote unquote more dangerous for them or simply has lower pay, right? We think in a world in which you have interventions and you provide affirmative action, for example, for these people, means that they have more opportunities available to them. But before I move on, I'll take the POI from CO.
So can you spend a bit more time explaining how your model works? Will you be okay with things like banning the burqa in places like Western European states?
Yeah, sure. So we think that it will exist in a spectrum, right? It could look like things like campaigns where you talk about like postpartum depression and how motherhood is not something that is rewarding, or not like banning people from wearing the hijabs and burqas. It can also be reformation in courts, like I talked about, where it's not beyond reasonable doubt. It can be forcefully separating like women from marriages where they are harmed and abused. It could mean banning sex work. It also could be like providing abortion, for example, because women are pressured into forcing to keep their baby. It's about governments giving the choice available to them and whatnot, right? So we think that in principle, as the feminist movement who needs to provide and work towards things like autonomy, equality, and even saving these individuals from themselves, it is their responsibility to do this. Second, even at the worst case, why this doesn't work, why is this something that is good? We think that one, it just simply shifts the Overton window. That is to say that when you as a feminist movement talk about this in government, when you spend like political capital and talking about this and whatnot, it means that you're also able to push for more opportunities, more affirmative action, even at the worst case where you don't ban it and people's autonomy to some extent is still curbed. It still means that they have more access to choices, right? But second, it is simply the discourse that exists. That is to say, people talking about motherhood not being rewarding, talking about how it's perfectly fine to leave a marriage, that your life is not going to be ruined if you don't wear a hijab, that you can still have a relationship with Allah if that's the case. We think that all of these discussions are important and cannot happen if you do not start this conversation as the feminist movement. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I invite the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for side opening opposition.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, but I think you're a little faint. Could you possibly move closer to the mic?
Right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's a little better now.
Hello, am I audible from this distance?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, agency is not the same as action. Not everything someone does demonstrates a free will or free ability to opt in to that choice. what is this debate about? This debate is about two things that my partner told you. One, that women do need more choices, and it's the responsibility of the feminist movement to get those institutional changes. Second, is that women need counter narratives to the existing oppressive mentality that women are meant to stay at home, that women must live up to certain beauty standards, that women must be subservient to their husbands, right? I think the context of this debate is that right now, the feminist movement has focused largely on social change. And this social change is something we do think has been successful, like the Me Too movement, sex strikes, which use the court of public opinion, or even the Gulabi gang in India, where they have now a 400,000 like women within that group. This debate is about what the feminist movement should be doing now. What we think is that the feminist movement should no longer just focus on social change or the court of public opinion, but now should look for institutional change in the legislature, right? Because we think that these are more permanent and much, much more sustainable. Recognize this debate is obviously not like a homogeneous blanket, like in all places we will ban the hijab, in all places we will ban sex work, right? My partner was very clear. We recognize that there's a spectrum of women. There's obviously different contexts around the world. If sex work is viewed as legitimate in one place where it is a safe job, there are government protections already, there's no reason to ban it, because obviously it's not an adaptive preference. It's literally you finding a very lucrative way to get money, versus a place where literally you have no other choice, where it's criminalized, where right now it's basically not safe. Or in Europe, where a lot of women are free, where it's quite secular, and where religion doesn't have an immense hold over your life, it's not likely there is a need to ban the hijab, because people will obviously be able to determine for themselves, do I want to wear it or not? We see this in states even like Malaysia and Indonesia, right? And obviously, we say this debate is about limiting the oppression where oppression exists, and we think these exist in patriarchal societies. That's a debate that they had to engage with. I don't think they did at all, right? Several questions in this debate. First, why are other alternatives that the previous speaker suggested not enough? One, in terms of the principle, I think historically, this is just unjust to only ask for incremental reforms, right? Historical oppression mandates or means that the women or the feminist movement is morally accountable to ask for huge changes for women right now. On their side, they might have things like microfinance, but that still relies on like women having business know-how and knowledge and connections, versus on our side, enforcing things like affirmative action in schools in India, Philippines, Pakistan, where women are literally forced to stay as housewives, to stay at home, to help in the family. Because education is much more important as a stepping stone for success and social mobility. Those are the types of changes that we want to see on our side of the house, right? But second, I think that the question of this debate probably is, why will this work, right? Very easy. So already we told you that there is a trend in terms of the court of public opinion of already supporting a lot of movements or a lot of policies that do help women. But most of this is concentrated with the moderates. A lot are still not institutionalized, right? What do we want on our side, and why is it likely? One, we think on our side, we have the idea of collective action, where we say the feminist movement's trajectory is now to actively ask for institutional change. We'll go out and lobby to our politicians. We will do things like strike. We will like call in like your senators, etc. The point is, women are half the population. If the feminist movement mobilizes, it's very likely you will be heard, right? But second, why will you even get that collective action to begin with? Because one, of the idea of inspiration, you create something incredibly urgent and controversial. Likely a lot of women will now see they are not alone.
Women actively reject these opportunities or don't want to take them, and you're forcing them to take them because you want to convert against these adaptive preferences.
Yeah, we're not forcing them to take anything. The point in this debate is the government has to aggressively make it so that women are able to access more choices. Like, for example, in courts, or having abortion rights, or example, being able to actively prosecute domestic violence, right? But even in the worst case that women don't want it, we say we don't care, because right now what we told you is that their choice is coerced. They might say, but oh no, like you're not really always completely like a free agent anyway. Your choices are constrained by society. But I think agency can be approximated, guys. I think things like right now where contracts can be void if people make it under duress or if there's misinformation or information asymmetry, that is the parallel here. Or even when there's religious indoctrination towards individuals, we say that a lot of their choices that they are making are just illegitimate and we cannot respect them, or even for minors, right? So the parallel here is
One minute and 20 seconds left.
sorry, I didn't hear that. Where did I get cut again?
I think you were talking about a parallel. Something about
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Clarice, can you turn off your camera because it might take bandwidth?
Oh, okay, thanks. No, actually, my internet just shut off. It wasn't the bandwidth. Sorry, unreliable Philippine internet. Yeah. Okay, ready? Yeah, so the parallel here are things like contracts where right now they can be voided if it is made under duress, there's misinformation or information asymmetry. We say that this is the same way where women are basically told from birth that they should act a certain way. They can only ever amount to a housewife. They should respect their husbands no matter what, right? We also parallel this to like when you're indoctrinated, where we say these choices are not actually free, or when you are a minor, where we don't give you the same or actually recognize that you have the same level of agency as an adult. So we say we've shown to you a lot of these women basically don't have choices. The point is we want to grant them more choices. So on our side, recognize this. The idea of getting a counter narrative or more choices, this benefit does not rely on the government necessarily buying in. Why? On our side, what we said is we move the Overton window, right? The point is through media attention, through getting debates where politicians are actively lobbying or feminist candidates are going city to city, informing individuals, talking about rights, talking about what the government should doing, or even through like social media posts. This is where women are at the very least able to recognize that they have other choices for them and they're not just trapped into living as how their male peers want them to. So I think on our side, at the very, very least, we have awareness and we have this idea of giving women more information to make better choices. They have to prove to us why this is not a great benefit that the feminist movement should not advocate for. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for side opening opposition.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, give me a moment. Starting in, sorry. Shut up. Oh, okay. Sorry, starting in 3, 2, 1. The proof that we have in opening opposition is incredibly simple. What we wanted to explain is that that side is likely to make it worse for women in the status quo, but also worse for the movement in the mid to long term. And that is what I think Clarice doesn't engage with in that speech. The premise of the opening government case is fundamentally that this is not a choice. If I can break that down in this speech, I will at least take opening gov out of the debate. The reality is that if this is the argument that they want to stand for, that requires them to hardline criminalize or at least heavily limit access. And the reason for that is that if not, all they are doing is to a large degree empowering and enabling the choice of women that they claim is fundamentally coercive in nature. But more than that, there's specific analysis cuts against the claim that they will be able to somehow not attack the women who currently benefit from this choice. First, because it's unclear to me why oppression on that side is going to be only in the direct instance of that you're not benefiting from oppression vis-a-vis broader societal forces that hurt a large majority of women. It's also the case that it's unclear to me why successful sex workers have more autonomy than sex workers who continue to be poor on that side of the house, at which point I'm not sure why they're able to limit the extent to which they're going to constrain women's choices. But secondly, note that the women on whom they rely to speak for themselves are also the ones who are the least vocal in the movement, because feminism tends to be a movement for the privileged, especially in terms of broader societal discourse, which means that they don't get to claim that they have somehow consent of these women. 3, note that things like strikes that they want to use as mechanisms raise strong feelings for more and more aggression and more action to exist on that side of the house, which in turn means that the likelihood of them being able to caveat hurting some women's choice is incredibly limited. Let's deal with this idea, therefore, that there's some obligation to ask for a big change. Because the reality is that this obligation doesn't exist until they prove to me that this is change that women want, or this is change that would necessarily be positive. The final thing they say is that they somehow have the backing of women. To the degree that this is about regulating choices, and they concede that in the status quo, some women are making choices but not aware that they are going to be hurt by the broader societal forces, then the best case scenario on that side is inherently that some women are going to have their choices taken away by other women without them realizing or consenting to this idea that the choices they make are non-consensual. At best, they are ultimately dependent on an arbitrary determination that some women have a choice, some women don't have a choice, and women who currently work in sex work and are going to be regulated against this are going to be the women who lose out on that side of the house. The core argumentation for Unsi therefore clashes against everything that you heard from Clarice and Alia, because what she tells you is that these are legitimate decisions that can be taken by these groups of people. The first thing to note is that just because society influences a decision does not necessarily mean that that decision is legitimate. Every decision we make is fundamentally one that is shaped by the social forces around us, because we are not tabula rasa and influenced by society. To that degree, they never explain the unique difference between these decisions and every other decision that is made that uniquely enables you to remove these choices or declare every bit of this choice fundamentally illegitimate. But the second thing to note is that just because your circumstances limit your agency does not mean that there is no agency whatsoever. Note that in order for them to prove that they will increase the choice of women, they need to prove that they remove the broad overarching societal forces that constrain women's choice in the status quo. The reality is that insofar as these choice forces and constraints exist, what we uniquely achieve on our side of the house is protecting the limited agency of women within this circumstances. To the degree that it's a scale, right? It's entirely unclear to me why on the scale, women in the status quo have no choice whatsoever in the status quo, but somehow more choice on that side. If I can protect limited choice rather than no choice, I think that's a win for agency of women. The reason this is important is because they are going to limit the choices of women, and I think that is fundamentally undignifying. First, because it's uniquely coercive on that side of the house, and the reality is that this transition is likely uniquely hard to achieve for women who are in teaching, for example, but who are suddenly called bad feminists, or women who spend their life working towards a particular goal which is suddenly going to be regulated and limited by the government. These are individuals who lose out disproportionately because they aren't able to transition to be the feminists that you want them to be. The implication of this is that your vulnerable women who are currently stuck in things like sex work take the biggest L because they don't have alternate means of success or financial success immediately available to them. The only argument we get to bulwark this is OO claiming that they can have other means of support like affirmative action. The problem is that these laws are considered concessions to the feminist movement because the feminist movement demanded them. There's therefore a reduction in political capital, from which point I don't see why you have additional political capital to do other things to benefit women. But secondly, note that I think they're going to make things actively worse for women within these circumstances. They say that the problem in the status quo is that governments aren't helping. I think the reality is that we can help as a feminist movement, but they can't. The reason for that is on that side. One, you can't simultaneously call for a ban and yet try to be supportive to women who flout this ban and flout directly what the feminist movement is telling them to do. But even if the feminist movement can do this, it is entirely unclear why women who individually feel vilified are going to trust the feminist movement to turn to them as a means of support. On net, therefore, they reduce the amount of support that women get on that side. They increase the degree of abuse and suffering when even the feminist movement is no longer a legitimate ally. Insofar as people are unlikely to trust the state, they're not likely to trust the feminist movement either. I'll take Naveen.
In both worlds, there is coercion. In the world of gov, the government is doing it. In your world, it's society. That's symmetrical. The comparative in the world of government is that the government can coerce people into making decisions that don't fundamentally harm them. What's your comparative to that extent?
No, right? The comparative is that you coerce more than we do, and that means that on net, like these are just false equivalencies that you're trying to draw. okay, the best case scenario on government requires them to prove that they'll actually create long-term change. Clary says two things. First, it is overturn window and discourse thing. I want to point out first that this doesn't require you to call the government to actively ban and limit the choices of women, as opposed to just suggesting what women can and cannot do. So I don't understand why that's exclusive. But secondly, on strikes, I think I want to note that at the end of the day, if you get this, then this requires you to stand for the biggest changes which are the most likely to hurt women's rights in the long term. But there were three mechanisms that we gave you at NC that went completely unresponded to, and I think these are important. The first thing to note is that what they do is that they place the burden on women because they entrench a narrative that what existed, what happens, and the reason why women suffer in the status quo and the reason why their choices are limited is because women are opting into this system. That therefore reduces the extent to which governments recognize the narrative that men or society writ large is the reason why women are suffering, as opposed to arguing that as opposed to arguing on that side of the house that women are the ones who entrench this suffering. The false imposition of this agency on the women by claiming that it's their fault is what reduces the political capital for us to turn to other means of creating change. This also gives the overturn window because I think you shift it the wrong way to burden women more. But secondly, I think they drive women away from the movement. A lot of the reason why women are likely to buy onto this movement is the feeling of agency that they get and feeling that they're actually able to fight for change. That requires these women who aren't currently the movement to actively buy into it, rather than feeling, one, that the movement is actively coercing women and limiting their choice and therefore driving them away from it, but two, also making women not have the ability to in future buy into this and change their minds because their minds are changed because they are limited. They're limited in their actions rather than them choosing to limit themselves out of this industry. The implication of that is that they're forcing women to act limits the extent to which women can be allies for the movement. To that degree, I think on that side of the house, they're unlikely to get positive change for women, but in doing so, they trade off the harm to women in the short term by not having the feminist movement stand for them. That's not something we think is conscionable. Thanks.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I invite the member of government to begin the closing half debate.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. Sorry, give me a minute. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There's a key aspect of this debate that the opening opposition has completely missed. There's a specific word. It's called unconscious. Billions of women around the world are sleepwalking into suffering. In closing government, we are gonna wake them up. Here's the thing that this debate first requires. This debate needs some damn clarity because I have no idea what's going on in the opening half. The first question I need to answer is, what is this gonna look like? Because from OG, we get virtually nothing. Right? Firstly, aggressive incentives can occur on a sliding scale. This means a couple of things. First, it can range from financial incentives in areas where these types of choices are not as damaging, possibly for the example of sex work, where it's quite regulated. We give tax breaks, better employment, good types of wage subsidies, for instance, if you are to depart from the wage or the sex work industries. This also looks like utilizing state media organizations to prop up narratives that are actively choices that may align with the patriarchy. In the most extreme circumstances where there is literally no ability to have control over said industries, then we are fine with implementing stuff like bans. However, I don't think the debate actually requires us to go to that extent or that extreme. The reason being that oftentimes when states offer financial incentives, tax breaks, or even like employment opportunities, these tend to be very successful in and of itself, right? The reason being is that they take care of the most immediate concerns that most women have when they are victimized by these industries to begin with. If you are a sex worker who is actively on OnlyFans because you need to pay for your university education, a state wage is what allows for you to depart from it to begin with. Because you don't have a real attachment to that industry, you are just in it for the money. For a vast majority of people we speak about in this debate, these types of state incentives will work. I recognize this is a slightly new mechanization coming from OG, and I think it's a little bit unfair to OO. So I'm willing to take a free flow of POIs from them to compensate for this. To clarify the model, OO, do you have anything right now?
Right, so your side can fiat that the feminist movement can do this. I don't think a feminist movement can lobby the government at a point at which it's supposed to implement a wage for every single woman. I think that you don't have the political capital to do that on your side of the house.
Okay, I agree with you. OG doesn't do that. Here's where CG enters the debate. I just started, right? Firstly, why is the decision-making process when it comes to deciding what type of behavior is harmful and not going to be quite equitable and does not incur the types of harms like blanket bans and blanket splintering of the feminist movement that opening opposition is suggesting? The first thing I would suggest is that the feminist movement is no longer a monolith. There are different versions of feminism that exist across the board and across the spectrum. There is religious feminism, there's choice feminism, but even within these categories, there are splintering categories of individuals because individual identities differ from one another. The next thing I will say is this. In 2020, the feminist movement has transitioned away from white feminism because white feminism and the leaders at the top now recognize that power is not centralized at the top. Change is not centralized at the top. It is the people who are going to come out on the streets and march from you is where power is centered into. This just means that in order to compel people to come out and do the things that feminist movement needs to be successful, such as marching on Capitol Hills, such as protesting against certain bills, you need to take into consideration the voices of the most vulnerable and also the voice of a vast majority of people. And let's just look at some statistics. A vast majority of the world is the developing world. A vast majority of the world are also minorities. When it comes to holding political power within feminism in 2020, individuals on the ground are the ones that have it the most. These are your sex workers. These are your minorities. So what does this mean for the particular debate? When it comes to deciding the parameters of what exactly it is we're going to ban and not support, these groups are integral in forming these types of opinions and will form the types of decision making that feminist movement is going to make to begin with. Why is this particularly important? The problem with OO is that they assume that this is a blanket choice and they have it unfettered. That's unreasonable in a world controlled by patriarchy. In the world of government, women who wear the hijab come to consensus on what exactly it is wearing the hijab is patriarchal and what is the line between patriarchy and not. Given the incentive structures I proved earlier, this is true and will happen. This mitigates a good chunk of the harms coming from opening opposition already. Secondly, why is this going to be successful? Why do the governments have an incentive to implement the models we're suggesting? First, let's look at the matter of this debate. If the debate, for this debate to operate, it assumes that the government has some incentive to collaborate with you to begin with. Because if they didn't, the feminist movement wouldn't consider advocating and collaborating with them to begin with. But secondly, let's just look at state incentives in 2020. Firstly, let's just deal with the developing world, because I think this is where the most contentious context is. In many parts of the developing world, conservatism, religiosity, and individuals who are anti-feminist are in a decline. Many of them have been exposed and collaborated with corruption scandals, such as, for instance, Najib Razak in Malaysia, to even Imran Khan in Pakistan. The brand of religiosity and conservatism is no longer as popular as it used to be. Even in the Arab world post the Arab Spring, when states that were religious, were actively authoritarian, many of them have lost popular support after seeing many governments fall, right? What does this prove? Religiosity is no longer a popular narrative within the developing world, and its popularity has been diminished to a significant extent. In order to pivot away from this dying political narrative, many states have actively adopted measures of liberalizing. The reason for this is because, firstly, it pivots an alternative that people are not actively antagonistic against, meaning if a state in Malaysia is willing to show, for instance, that is willing to adopt to certain women reforms, they are able to distinguish themselves away from past corrupted administrations. That's why, for example, Malaysia Sharia courts, as patriarchal as they are, now literally have a female chief justice. They also have a majority of women judges currently sitting. This proves conclusively that our policy can work. We have the incentive structures for it to occur, and we will be successful. Let me move into the outcomes then, given I have done all the groundwork that opening government refused to do. Here's the narrative. First, in liberal context, while OO may agree that and argue that this is choice feminism, I would posit that choice feminism has been co-opted. In much of the developed world, capitalism has entrenched itself within feminism. Much of capitalism has also taken control of industries such as the sex work industry. For many women that are currently having OnlyFans account, you only see the money, you only see the bling, but you don't see the mental anguish that comes with people leaking your photos. Companies have an incentive to protect yourself and to protect you from that particular information. What's the comparative in our world? Even if we don't convince women to leave the platform, they at least have a chunk of information that they previously did not have, such as the potential dangers that occur on platforms like OnlyFans, for instance. They can at least take preventative steps to prevent this from happening. Or then argues and suggests, aha, it's coercion. But guys, it's symmetrical. In both worlds, there is coercion, right? Whether it's from society and whether it's from the state. If this is true, and if this is the comparative in the world of government is that if they are coerced, they are at the least not coerced into making decisions that are fundamentally damaging for them, and they can at least take preventative measures. For those reasons, it's time to wake up. This nightmare is over. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I invite the member of opposition to begin the case for side closing opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Awesome, great. Just give me a minute, I'll just fix my papers.
Nico, your video's not on, I think.
Yeah, sorry. Just getting my phone and stuff like that. What's up? All right. Let's start in 3, 2, 1. I think government bench says that women are too foolish to understand their own oppression. And therefore, this is not simply a debate about whether or not this is choice or coercive, etc. It is the perception of whether or not we can trust women to make their own decisions that is fundamentally affirmed by government that they say that it cannot. Especially when the Naveen says that women sleep and we must wake them up. Who does this? I think it affirms that women are damsels in distress, and we ought to make decisions for them, especially when given the legitimacy of the most powerful movement that ought to say they cater and represent women. I will explain 2 things. Number 1, while this massively diminishes the future capacity of women to be able to get advancement, and take note, a lot of these things that come from GovBench rely on a lot of this lobbying being massively successful. I will say it will affirm ways that coercive and dangerous governments will be able to interpret and do this on their own. But secondly, I will say that it strengthens abusive and coercive state forces, like the police, like the government, and I guess like sexist and abusive law enforcement, that is only going to make the situation worse for the most vulnerable of women. So, why is this motion principally wrong, and what are the logical implications of that? Number 1, it is to say that women are psychologically coerced and therefore cannot be trusted to make these decisions. Clarice cannot say, well, we won't do this in Europe because they have access to information, and then Naveen repeats this point on information. Take note, he must look at the same word he pointed out. Unconsciously. No change in information is going to say that women can now rationally calculate these things, because it'll always affirm that women unconsciously are not going to be able to look at the pros and cons of the decisions that they make, because they have slowly internalized the kinds of oppressions that they have. What does this mean for the position of women? Number 1, they do not clarify how governments are likely to do this. I argue that the ability for governments to do things like engage in consultative processes with sex workers, work with female-empowered NGOs, and cooperate with the feminist movement are far less likely to the extent that you say women are psychologically coerced, are unaware of the decisions that they make, and therefore should not have a hand in legislation, should not have a hand in the capacity to change the ways in which the most vulnerable women operate and work in the world today. Take note, this is especially true for the women who need these consultative processes the most, the women who need the vote the most, because these are the women who are most coerced on their side by poverty, by their family, by religion, and all the structures government points out, but are victim to these things and therefore cannot make a decision on how to uproot themselves from these kinds of things. Take note, a lot of the positive material that comes from CG on gradual change that is already happening show that we do not need this policy to occur. There are natural incentives for the advancement and progression of women that require not this massive state action and shift in strategy. Secondly, the feminist movement is not a know-it-all movement. It is a movement where power is concentrated. At the top, the women who have the most advocating and lobbying power are women who are probably well-educated, liberal, and live in the Western world, probably have far more privilege in terms of skin and wealth. I would say let's spin this principle. If you think the justification to do this is to ensure that we do not allow the past coercions of women to ensure that they make certain decisions, I would say you shift that coercion from the basis of sex to the basis of race, the basis of religion, and the basis of privilege. Because now these women tell the women who have little to no capacity to operate in the feminist movement how they ought act, how they ought be convinced that they no longer be oppressed, rather than how these individual women assess their own situation and act what is best on their own behalf. Take note again, these women are the most vulnerable and therefore need the feminist movement as a safe space the most, and therefore will be unable to access the kinds of representation and consultative measures to be able to ensure they can live good lives. Thirdly, it is to say that your identity as a woman are independent of other patriarchal structures. This sounds like a good thing, but I don't think so, because government will not eliminate the notion of a family. Government will not eliminate religion, government, or even hell capitalism, if that's where CG wants to go. But it is the assertion of the feminist movement that your femininity is independent and in fact incompatible with religion, with femininity, that you ought not have the methods of which we can advance women in society, which often require the integration into religion and therefore are more likely to get the kinds of privileges of power, respect, and tolerance that come from their male counterparts. Because you say feminism is an inherent attack to your family, to your religion, to whatever patriarchal quote-unquote structure that they assert from government bench. And therefore, a lot of the ways in which we can change perceptions of women, a lot of the ways in which we can advance feminism in the political process are less likely to happen to the degree that we say they're incompatible with the most powerful structures, and don't let them get away with saying religiosity is declining. Take note, a lot of these structures held the family is one of the basic tenets of society. Religion is incredibly strong in the places where this motion is required the most, as they quote and as they point out, are therefore unlikely to be effective. But lastly and culturally, this is how it makes sure that you amplify the dangerous narratives that exist for women, because they make acts of sex as acts of coercion that they foolishly opt into and therefore justify and amplify the capacity to do things like slut shame women. They justify that Islam is inherently an anti-feminist religion and women are coerced to believe in it. That justifies a lot of Islamophobia. Look, if states act not, then it is likely to be cultural and likely the people around them who will act in inflammatory methods and ways that is going to be dangerous for how women are treated on the ground. On all these bases, if there's positive progress for women that already exists, you reverse that tremendously by saying they ought be independent of all the other identities that they make and cannot make decisions for themselves. Secondly, I would say that aggressive state action strengthens the abusive and coercive state forces. Take note, this is likely to be done by law enforcement. The police, who will do the criminalization of prostitution opening government wants, who will look out for the women who have banned the burqa. These are dangerous structures because these are the same ones, and this assumes their policy passes. These are the same ones that have forwarded cultures of machismo, ones that are likely concentrated towards people who are quite privileged on the basis of their skin and have been most dangerous towards women of color, most dangerous towards women in the developing world, and especially in the developing world where they have little to no capacity to check and balance themselves. I would say even if they had good intentions with what policies ought to be enforced, the method of enforcement is likely to be done by dangerous actors where there are high rates of sexual violence, high rates of abuse that occur within police systems, within methods of being able to enforce the law that therefore make it incredibly dangerous for any woman who has to watch out the next time she has to hide her burqa from the police, who has to watch out if ever she makes a public expression of her own religion, who has to watch out because she is a sex worker that is nowhere else to turn to. This is a dangerous world for women to live in, not only for their own agency, but for all the fundamental quote-unquote harms to their safety that government posits. I'm very proud to stand for the autonomy that women ought to be respected and believed to have. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I invite the government whip to conclude the debate for side government.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Thank you. Just give me a quick second, yeah? Love you too, Hans. It is a disservice to women for this debate and the entirety of Op Bench to presume that women right now are comfortable with the choices that they are making, when the choices that they are making are Hobson choices that have been forced to a corner and they are forced to choose between whether or not they ought to do sex work or they ought to not have money at the end of the day. We don't think these are choices that women are happy with, and this is exactly why we ought to err on the side of helping women who are suppressing their anger and trying to convince themselves that they are doing this as a self-defense mechanism as opposed to one that is pandering to the patriarchy. The metric that we ought to use in this debate is whether or not does the patriarchy actually benefit from the choices that women make, more so than women do in making these choices. We think in all of these adaptive choices that women make, men and capitalism that is driven by men benefit significantly more. That is exactly why we ought to have an aggressive policy against this. I'm going to have like a couple of responses to the closing opposition before I talk about our extension material and why we conclusively take this debate. The first thing that I want to talk about in the closing opposition speech is with regards, and I think this is also quite similar to what opening opposition tried to run, about whether or not women are making good decisions when they are adapting. I think an incredibly important nuance, and I think the speaker before me didn't engage in Naveen's speech when he pointed this out, is that the Infoslide says that you're unconsciously making these decisions because of the fact that you're trying to shield yourself from like whatever circumstances that you have right now and to feel less discomfort. That is a short-term decision that you're making, but you're dooming your entire life and you're making an entire choice that empowers men at large, empowers capitalism at large, is a reason why we ought to err on the side of correcting it. We think this adaptation specifically is not an inherent, absolute, respectable choice per se, but rather just a self-defense mechanism that women take right now to feel like they have some degree of control over their lives. As individuals who are able to see this from a third person's point of view, absent of the indoctrinative structures that women exist in right now that pushes them to make these adaptive choices, as this feminist movement, we ought to make these decisions for these women to help them like break out of these indoctrinative indoctrinative environments and to be able to access more choices. It is exactly by these policies that states make that helps these women fight this coercion. But also to suggest that women right now can make good choices just forelooks the entire like strength of coercive forces that already exist right now and how we need state infrastructure and we need to push governments who are currently misguided right now and are trying to be feminists but don't know what to do and are not like specifically targeting in a way to access the movement that needs it the most. I think we need to combat things like capitalism, which benefits because men are oftentimes the ones who hold the most amount of capital within capitalism, and capitalism coerces women into continually making these choices and adapting because of the fact that they can get away with the facade that they are doing this, get away with the facade that they're convincing themselves that this is a good choice for me, as opposed to one that literally panders to larger patriarchal superstructures, but also doesn't take into account the strong social indoctrination that also exists. So in a community where they are huge, highly patriarchal communities that pushes women into sex work because they only believe that women ought to be objectified on sexuality, we are extremely happy to employ a ban if it means that the feminist movement determines in this specific choice, as the Infoslide says, the context varies and the degrees of indoctrination varies, as so our aggressive choices and to what extent we employ the worst methods are also contingent upon the degrees of indoctrination that exist in these communities. That's why we're happy to employ things like bans. But the second thing I want to engage with the speaker before me is this idea that we already have positive progress, and right now when you empower law enforcement is likely going to be very abusive. I think the first thing is that this engagement is incredibly convenient. It's contingent upon just a banning circumstance. Doesn't tell me why on various other fronts when we have universities teaching women to opt out of nursing and to opt into becoming a doctor, like on all these fronts, where do you get this abuse of power? But in the worst case scenario, if we do need to ban, as I mentioned earlier, because the choices are incredibly infringed upon, women don't have the ability to recognize that the choices that they're making are unconscious and are not necessarily the ones that are empowering themselves, but largely due to the fact that they're doing it because patriarchy has coerced them through social indoctrination. We are happy to employ aggressive policies in this instance as well. But note, aggressive doesn't mean I must punch you in the face, I must have cops literally arresting everybody. Aggressive just means we have to significantly replace the capital or move the capital, and the degrees in which we are intervening and the extent to which we are intervening and the amount of money we're putting in is also aggressive as well. They cannot just push the debate to be this weird definition of aggressiveness. I want to talk really quickly about Naveen's extension attention a bit more on why this wins us this debate. I think it's really important to acknowledge right now that states are currently liberalizing. There is incentive for them to want to help women at large. And I think the question is about where do we show the government as to where to funnel that money specifically and how to help women. I think opening opposition just presumes, and also similarly closing opposition presumes, that states currently know what to do. And I think opening opposition really wants to like defend corporations and like having them on our side and like helping them as well. And this is where I'll explain to you why capitalism inherently is fucked right now and why we ought to err on the side of like dismantling that. Because I think this policy specifically allows for women or allows for governments to intervene in places where women don't know that they're making choices that are harming themselves. So fair enough, there will be initial backlash, but I think working hand in hand with the feminist movement also means allowing women to realize that this is an adaptive choice that you have made and pointing out things like, for example, companies like OnlyFans, for examples, that literally get you to sign up because of the fact that like get you to sign up and say that this is a great way to make money in the short run, like dooming women at large to like the fact that they could possibly ruin their entire lives, but like men oftentimes continue like sexualizing them and making them objectifying them and perpetuating rape culture at large as well. I think all of these are conclusions that are not shown to you as a woman on the ground. I think through these specific aggressive tactics, we are able to educate women as well. Before that, let me take one from opening opposition.
Right, the entire government characterizes these women as having to make these choices out of circumstance, but never maps how exactly their economic and family circumstances can change. How will you ever get from limited capital the massive changes that you actually want?
Yeah, we have limited capital right now, but the limited capital is pushed into doing things like, for example, increasing the amount of teaching jobs, for example, like getting women to do sex work, for example, because like governments can be lackadaisical and look past these things, right? In a world where you literally shift that like capital away and get governments to spend in, for example, increasing the amount of doctor jobs or contrary jobs that allow women to access like the non-conventional like things that, or they just access to agency that are able to make better choices for what empowers them on their own. They're able to undo these degrees of indoctrination. I think in a world where we can definitely fiat by saying that there's going to be aggressive amounts of like reshifting of the capital right now. If you can also suggest an opening opposition and similarly closing opposition that there are trends right now and there's positive change, there's also capital in that presumption as well. We're happy to shift that presumption under our. But lastly and really quickly, why do we think the fact that this specific type of model right now in a world where women making adaptive preferences is not necessarily a good choice? I think the fact that men continue to be able to unjustly and immorally benefit off the choices that women make right now because of the fact they can keep treating you like an object. If you are a sex worker, you can convince yourself as much as possible that you're doing good and you're putting money on your table. That doesn't take away from the fact that women at large are harmed. The feminist movement owes a duty to net better the community. For these reasons specifically, I've never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I invite the opposition whip to conclude this debate.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. I want to be very clear about how we will win this debate. The entire government bench seems to claim that the people who are subconsciously forced into these positions or roles are the most oppressed and important stakeholders that we ought to care about. So if closing opposition is able to prove to you that these people are worse off, it is what makes us win the debate over opening, which seems to also try to focus on other people who we would agree are disenfranchised, but are not the same degree of disenfranchisement that the entire government bench wanted to argue in today's debate. Noticeably, Gov had to prove two things that they're not able to do. The first is, Fiat assumes that the feminist movement will advocate for these policies, but not that the advocacy will lead to the policy change in the first place. Noticeably, the vast majority of CG's material and OG's material is contingent on the policy or government intervention working, and therefore if you're not able to do so, the trade-offs that Miko identified in his speech is significantly more important. But secondly, we would suggest assumes that the policy changes that they fight for will actually lead to things that are good. Note that they cannot fiat the policy changes to be good and representative. Miko provides you an analysis by explaining why when you delegitimize the agency of women, when you perceive them to be objects of oppression and not active agents in their own history, that's when you prevent them from having the consultative process for change. So firstly, will this policy be passed? The only analysis only came out coming from closing government. When they said that religiosity is on the decline, this is factually untrue, right? So I think Najib Razak, while he declined a few years ago, recently starting to rise into power again. You have the rise of the BJP in India. You have the rise of the Islamic radicalism in Indonesia, in places like Banda Aceh, for example. So it's unclear whether or not their religiosity is on the decline under their side. And the structural reason behind that is, in times of economic insecurity, in times of political inequality, people tend to hold on to religion as their only source of solace. That defeats their counter-assertion of analysis. But secondly, in instances where religiosity is on the decline, it's usually replaced by things like toxic machismo culture, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example, or Trump in the United States. So it's unclear whether or not a decline in religiosity means that people are more likely to listen to the feminist movement under their side of the house. And the logical reason for this is, with the rise of things like populism, where people are feeling insecure about themselves, they need to resort to things like scapegoating to blame other individuals. I want to note that the harm here of them trying but failing is not symmetric. And the reason for it is all the arguments coming from Miko that I don't think Lupi sufficiently responded to. The fact that you perpetuate a harmful narrative that women of the feminist movement are unlikely to have agency themselves, because people can lump up the fact that you say that people are so structurally disenfranchised that they don't have a choice, and with these individuals. But secondly, the fact that you have to create harmful narratives against other particular minorities, things like having to delegitimize Islam because you say it's very, very coercive, or delegitimize things like particular races and say that their cultures are very repressive. Noticeably, these things harm women also, and therefore you ought to care about them under their side. Also, and I want to be generous to opening opposition here, all their other claims then, if you believe this analysis coming from Miko, are able to work, right? So their claims about having concessions for other things, the fact that they're able to make sure that they delegitimize the movement, reduce supporters, which are less important, now become important if you're able to believe the claim that we prove at closing opposition that this policy is unlikely to be passed. The only other analysis that they use to preempt this comes from the opening government, when they say, well, at least we're able to shift the Overton window. You cannot just assert that the Overton window will be shifted and that's a good thing. It is possible that the narrative that they're using becomes misinterpreted. And that is the analysis coming from Miko, which is that at the point where you start telling women that they don't have agency and they're off to stop them, it is likely that it's convenient for a lot of the conservatives to use this to justify a lot of their claims, that women are not capable of making their own choices, that women are emotional, that the women are controlled, and therefore they need guardians to protect them. Therefore, they need a male patriarchy to protect them. And that's the reason why, assuming this policy is not passed, they don't get their benefits and they don't get the change. In fact, they harm the movement as a whole. But let's be generous to the government bench. Let's assume that this policy is passed. Why will it likely lead to worse outcomes? I want to note that it's not as simple as saying we intervene in sex work and therefore sex workers become better off, or we intervene in religious communities and therefore communities are better off. Noticeably, opening government already conceded that it's a very, very complicated process. That we cannot just take them out of their jobs or ban sex work, because a lot of times this will lead to negative repercussions. And noticeably, this is not simple that I would suggest I am able to claim. There are psychological factors here, there are cultural factors here, there are social factors here, and there are legal factors here. The important part here is, at no point can Gov fiat that the feminist movement will be able to know all of these things already. And what closing opposition provides is, at the point where you start delegitimizing them, because the only way for you to justify this policy is to tell them that they shouldn't be listened to because their consciousness already made, or they're too oppressed to make sense or logical sense, is when you're not able to represent their particular interests and not be able to hear their particular voices. And that's important, because it's when consulting with sex workers, for example, that you know that their biggest problem is not that all all clients, it is some particular clients, and giving them particular opportunities or giving things like psychological counseling might be the optimal solution. But you're not able to determine that when you create a narrative that they should not be listened to in the very first place. And that's what you're not able to get under their side of the house. Before we move on, opening government.
So should the feminist movement never advocate for institutional change or tell women to leave their abusive relationships because there will be backlash or because they're not representative?
No, but they should do things that are far more strategic for them to work. Secondly, don't trade off the potential of delegitimizing agency. It is a question of whether or not this strategy is successful, which we have nuance to prove why it's problematic. That's why we reduce the agency analysis, and I don't think that closing government is able to respond. Their only analysis why this works is to assert that the feminist movement is no longer a monolith and has transitioned from white feminism. This is not true for a couple of reasons. The first is, it's not about the number of people. So even if you believe that there are more developing world feminists right now, it's about the amount of political power and political capital you have that is still concentrated among white individuals. Secondly, we would suggest that the suppression of other minority interests, like the rise of things like racism or the resurgence of racism, resurgence of religious discrimination, means that it's likely that this intersects within feminist circles and therefore suppresses a lot of individuals too. But thirdly, we would suggest that at the point where you start delegitimizing people under their side, that's when you're far more likely to make people who are in these movements less representative and therefore not able to get the change. That's why their mechanism where the feminist movement will be able to intervene doesn't necessarily work. But lastly, we suggested, even if the feminist movement is able to intervene properly, it is the enforcement that's the problem. And it's not only the police that's a problem, which I think closing government only responds to, and says it's not only about the police. Teachers can be conservative and sexist. Social workers can be conservative and sexist. At the point where you reinforce, you admit a conservative state institution, that means you give them more of the power and discretion to create more harmful effects within society. And notably, at best, Gov can fiat that the policy will be passed or argue that the policy will be passed, but not that the feminist movement will have full control of their policies. Presumably, conservative interests will still intervene and enter into these arguments and enter into these discussions, and therefore are likely to do things that are easier to do, like just ban the burqa altogether, ban all these policies because it makes a click machismo popular culture narrative versus a slow reform that you need when you listen to people. We cannot promise a solution to women who are disenfranchised. What we promise them, however, is that we're able to listen to them, something that government bench is not able to do, and that's why we're very proud to take this championship. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech.